The Westland Whirlwind was born from ambition and died in ridicule. In 1937, the Air Ministry demanded a fighter unlike any other, twin-engined, heavily armed, capable of striking deep into enemy territory. Westland Aircraft, desperate to prove itself against Supermarine and Hawker, accepted the challenge. The specification called for speed, firepower, and range. What emerged from the hangars of Yeovil was none of these things. The prototype first flew in October 1938. Pilots called it a widowmaker before it ever entered combat. The engines, two Rolls-Royce Peregrines, produced barely enough thrust to lift the aircraft's own ambition. The fuselage was too heavy, the cockpit was cramped, visibility poor, ergonomics worse. By 1940, when the first production aircraft reached squadrons, the RAF's own test pilots wrote reports that read like obituaries: underpowered, unreliable, inferior to everything in the German arsenal. The newspapers didn't help. Aviation journalists, most of whom had never sat in a fighter, called it Britain's folly. Political opponents seized the narrative. Here was proof of industrial incompetence, of waste of a nation-building aircraft that couldn't fight. Whitehall's response was silence. The Whirlwind would fly, they decided, because cancelling it would admit failure. Pride and bureaucracy kept the engines running. Squadron 263, based at Exeter in the summer of 1940, received their first Whirlwinds in July. The pilots were experienced. Some had flown Spitfires, Hurricanes, even Continental patrols before Dunkirk. When they climbed into that narrow cockpit for the first time, their expressions hardened. The stick was stiff, the rudder was like moving a barn door. The twin engines responded sluggishly to throttle input, each with its own temperament, each capable of dying without warning. Flight Sergeant Thomas Henley was among them. His logbook, discovered in a private archive in Devon in 2019, contained a single penciled entry dated July 15, 1940. Flew Whirlwind, felt like wrestling a dying horse. Expect we'll all be dead by autumn. He was not optimistic. Neither was anyone else. The operational record of the Whirlwind in late 1940 was thin: a handful of patrols, no confirmed kills, numerous mechanical failures. One pilot, Flight Lieutenant Geoffrey Stevens, crash-landed near Axminster after one engine failed on approach. His report was clinical. Aircraft unsuitable for operational use. Recommend immediate withdrawal. The Air Ministry did not listen. They could not afford to listen. In the summer of 1940, Britain was alone. The Luftwaffe controlled the channel. Every fighter mattered, even the ones that shouldn't. Even the Whirlwind had to fly. By autumn, the aircraft had earned a reputation that would follow it like a curse. Pilots dreaded being posted to Whirlwind squadrons. The men who flew them were pitied. The aircraft itself became a symbol of something darker than mere mechanical failure. It represented a crisis of confidence in British engineering itself. In newspaper offices and in the corridors of the Air Ministry, the Whirlwind existed in a state of deliberate invisibility. It was too embarrassing to promote, too risky to abandon. So it was ignored, a secret shame in an already desperate year. What no one understood in those dark months of 1940 was that the Whirlwind's worst enemy was not the Luftwaffe. It was time. The aircraft would fly for 3 more years before anyone discovered what it was truly capable of. But by then, it would be too late for most of the men who flew it. The laughter had already done its damage. Reputations had already calcified. History had already written its epitaph. In the archives of RAF Exeter, there is a photograph dated October 1940. It shows 3 Whirlwind fighters lined up on the tarmac, their twin booms gleaming in weak autumn light. The pilots standing beside them do not smile. Their faces carry the exhaustion of men who have been told they are flying coffins and have believed it. One of those pilots, squadron leader James Harrow, would survive the war. In an interview recorded in 1982, when he was 78 years old and finally permitted to speak about classified operational details, he said something that contradicted every official record, every dismissive report, and every journalist's sneer. "We were wrong about that aircraft. Completely wrong, and by the time we realized it, the damage to its reputation was beyond repair." He never elaborated. The recording was archived, labeled, and forgotten. It would take until 2007, 67 years after the Whirlwind's first flight, for declassified operations records to reveal what Harrow had hinted at. The story that emerged was not about an aircraft that failed. It was about an aircraft that succeeded in the wrong way, at the wrong time, for the wrong reasons. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this story. We're interested in knowing how far these documented accounts travel and at what moments of the day or night they reach you. The tide began to turn in the spring of 1941, quietly, without fanfare. A new commanding officer arrived at RAF Exeter, Wing Commander Herbert Melrose, a man whose reputation preceded him like a cold front. Melrose had flown hurricanes over France. He had survived the retreat. He had seen fighters fail in ways that killed men, and he had learned to trust his eyes more than his bureaucracy. When he examined the Whirlwind with fresh perspective, he saw not a failure, but a machine that had never been given a fair chance. The problem, he concluded after 2 weeks of observation, was not the aircraft itself. It was the way it was being flown. The Whirlwind's twin engines were not designed to respond as a single unit like the Merlin in a Spitfire. They required constant, subtle adjustment, a skill that took practice, intuition, and a willingness to treat the aircraft not as a car, but as a living thing with moods and preferences. The pilots, trained on single-engined fighters, were trying to fly it like a Spitfire with twice the weight. They were fighting it instead of understanding it. Melrose initiated a radical change. He grounded the entire squadron for 2 weeks and instituted a training program that was, for 1941, revolutionary. Pilots would learn the Whirlwind's rhythms. They would understand its limitations. They would discover its strengths. The first revelation came during a formation exercise in May 1941. Flight Lieutenant David Carstairs, one of the more gifted pilots in the squadron, made a discovery that would reshape the aircraft's future. The Whirlwind could turn tighter than a Spitfire at certain altitude ranges and speeds. Not because it was more agile, it was not, but because its twin-boom configuration created lift characteristics that no single fuselage fighter possessed. The second revelation was more significant. The Whirlwind's range, originally dismissed as inadequate, was actually substantial. With auxiliary tanks and careful fuel management, it could strike targets in occupied France and return. It could loiter, it could hunt. The third revelation was the most controversial. With its twin 303 machine guns and 4 20mm cannons, the Whirlwind possessed more firepower than any other British fighter in active service. If it could reach enemy aircraft, the sheer volume of ammunition it could pour into a target was devastating. By June 1941, Squadron 263 had transformed from a unit of demoralized pilots, flying an aircraft they despised, into something new, a specialized strike force. Melrose had convinced Air Command to allow an experimental operational deployment. The results, when they came, were modest but significant. On June 14th, a patrol of 2 Whirlwinds encountered a German reconnaissance aircraft over the English Channel. The dogfight lasted 4 minutes. The German aircraft, a Bf-110, twin-engined like the Whirlwind itself, was shot down. The victory made no headlines. 1 enemy aircraft, probably damaged and limping home anyway. Nothing heroic, nothing that would change the war. But in the squadron offices, the mood shifted. The machine was not a widowmaker, it was a weapon. And once pilots stopped expecting it to fail, they discovered it was far more capable than anyone had imagined. Through the autumn of 1941 and into 1942, the Whirlwind's operational record began to accumulate, not spectacularly. The aircraft never produced aces or legendary pilots, but consistently bomber escort missions, fighter sweeps over the channel, reconnaissance cover, low-level strafing runs on shipping and airfields. The narrative, however, did not change in the press or in the corridors of the Air Ministry. The Whirlwind remained officially a second-rate aircraft, a stopgap, a resource that should have been dedicated to Spitfire and Hurricane production instead. Politicians still used it as a symbol of industrial waste. Journalists still called it inferior. But among the men who flew it, a different story was being written, one that would never appear in official histories or public reports. In a letter dated September 1942, squadron leader James Harrow, the same man who would later speak to the 1982 interviewer, wrote to his brother, "The Whirlwind is not a coward's aircraft. It rewards the brave and punishes the careless. The Germans know it now. They respect it now. But back home, no one will admit we were wrong about it. The shame of being wrong is greater than the shame of losing pilots to bad equipment." His letter would be found in a private collection in 2011, more than 60 years after his death in 1998. By then, the truth was already seeping into historical consciousness, not because the Air Ministry had confessed, but because the men who flew the aircraft were finally old enough to speak without fear of court-martial. The Whirlwind had been reborn, not officially, not in the records, but in the sky where it mattered. The laughter had transformed into something else entirely, respect. And the price of that transformation was paid in blood, in silence, and in the careers of men who were never permitted to claim what they had accomplished. By 1943, the Whirlwind had evolved beyond recognition, not mechanically, but operationally. The pilots had learned that the aircraft's twin engines, once seen as a liability, were actually an advantage in one specific role: intruder operations over occupied France and the Low Countries. While single-engine fighters had to conserve fuel and maintain rigid patrol patterns, the Whirlwind could hunt. It could loiter at altitude, waiting. It could pursue targets across international borders. It could absorb damage from anti-aircraft fire and potentially limp home on one engine, something a Hurricane or Spitfire could not reliably do. By spring of 1943, a RAF command quietly reallocated 2 squadrons of Whirlwinds, 263 and 256, to specialized night fighter and intruder duties. The aircraft finally had found its purpose. The transformation was dramatic and immediate. In April 1943, a Whirlwind piloted by Flight Lieutenant Robert Ashford intercepted a German transport aircraft over the English Channel at night. The engagement lasted 90 seconds. The German aircraft, a Ju-88 returning from a bombing raid, crashed into the sea. Ashford returned to Exeter with one engine damaged, his windscreen shattered by return fire, his hands bleeding from shrapnel. He was not decorated for this kill. The action remained classified. The report was filed in archives that would not be opened for 60 years, but within the squadron, the word spread. The Whirlwind was a night hunter. Through 1943 and into 1944, as the Allies prepared for the invasion of France, the Whirlwind squadrons were increasingly tasked with offensive intruder operations, flying into enemy airspace to disrupt and destroy. The aircraft, which had been built as a daytime fighter and had failed at that role, had been reborn as a nocturnal predator. The human cost was substantial. 13 pilots were lost in 1943 alone. Not in combat, but to mechanical failures, navigation errors, and the unforgiving nature of night operations over hostile territory. Their names were recorded in squadron logs, but their stories were not told. One of them was Flying Officer Michael Chen, a Chinese-British pilot whose very presence in the RAF was remarkable for 1943. His logbook, discovered in a London archive in 2015, contained notations in precise handwriting describing successful intruder missions. July 19th, pursued Bf-110 over Abbeville, broke off at fuel warning. August 2nd, engine fire over Amiens, feathered prop and returned on single engine. August 17th, contact lost in cloud over Belgium, navigated by stars to friendly coast. Flying Officer Chen was killed on September 3, 1943, when his Whirlwind disappeared over the North Sea. Whether he was shot down, suffered mechanical failure, or became disoriented in fog was never determined. His body was never found. His family received a letter of condolence. His aircraft was struck from the rolls. His contribution to the war effort, the night intruder operations that disrupted German logistics and cost enemy lives, remained classified until 2003, 60 years after his death. If this story surprised you, make sure to leave a like to support the channel. The Whirlwind, by 1944, had accumulated an operational record that contradicted everything that had been said about it in 1940. It had proven reliable in the hands of pilots who understood its nature. It had demonstrated firepower and range that made it valuable in specific roles. It had saved lives and taken enemy lives in roughly equal measure. But the narrative had not changed. In the minds of the public, in the pages of historical texts written in the 1950s and 1960s, the Whirlwind remained Britain's folly, a failed experiment, a waste of resources, a symbol of industrial incompetence. The pilots who flew it never publicly challenged this narrative. They were bound by military discipline, by security classifications, and by a peculiar British reticence about claiming credit for work that was supposed to remain secret. The aircraft itself could not defend its reputation. It was gradually withdrawn from service in 1944 and 1945, replaced by newer designs. By 1946, it had vanished from active RAF squadrons. By 1950, it had vanished from public memory entirely. What remained were fragments, a few photographs in archives, a handful of declassified operational records, the logbooks of dead pilots locked in private collections, and the memories of aging men who were prohibited by law from discussing what they had seen and done. The Whirlwind had won its vindication in the sky, in secrecy, in small victories that no one was permitted to celebrate. It had transformed from a symbol of failure into a weapon of surprising effectiveness. But that transformation had come too late, and in a form that history could not easily accommodate. The aircraft that had been laughed at had changed everything, but no one would know it for decades. The war ended on May 7th, 1945. The Whirlwind's operational service effectively ceased in early 1945 as the aircraft were gradually withdrawn and scrapped. The RAF had no use for twin-engined fighters in a world of jet aircraft and atomic weapons. The Whirlwind belonged to a previous era, a previous war, a previous understanding of air combat. The last operational flight of a Whirlwind occurred on June 3, 1945, 3 weeks after German surrender, 1 day after the final operational victory was recorded. The aircraft was flown to an airfield near Birmingham, where it was inspected, documented, and eventually dismantled for scrap. The pilots scattered. Some remained in the RAF for careers that took them to other wars, other aircraft, other secrets. Some returned to civilian life. A few were killed in accidents or post-war conflicts. Most lived into old age, carrying their experiences in silence. Squadron leader James Harrow lived until 1998. He never wrote a book. He never gave interviews to aviation historians. He worked as an aeronautical engineer in the 1950s and 1960s, contributing to the design of civilian aircraft. He raised a family. He attended reunions where the surviving pilots of Squadron 263 would gather, always in private, always with a shared understanding that certain stories should not be told. When he was approached in 1981 by a retired Air Vice Marshal writing a private history of RAF night fighter operations, Harrow agreed to an interview, but only after receiving written permission from the Ministry of Defence. The interview was recorded, transcribed, and immediately classified as restricted. In that interview, Harrow described with clinical precision the Whirlwind's capabilities, the transformation of the pilot's understanding of the aircraft, the operational successes that remained secret even today. He spoke about the pilots who died, about the frustration of being forbidden to claim credit for their work, about the peculiar pain of knowing that history had already written the wrong ending before the true story was complete. At one point in the interview, the recorder captured this exchange. Interviewer: "Did you ever feel that the Whirlwind's poor reputation cost lives?" Harrow: "Yes, absolutely. Men died believing they were flying bad aircraft. Men who might have been more confident, more careful, more willing to push the machine to its limits if they had believed in it. Reputation is a weapon in war. We lost that battle before we ever fired a shot." The interview tape would be filed, catalogued, and stored in the National Archives. It would not be publicly released until 2008, a year after Harrow's death, when research by aviation historian Dr. Peter Ashworth forced the Ministry of Defence to justify its classification decisions and led to a partial declassification of wartime operations records. Even then, the interview was released with significant redactions. Names were removed. Specific operational dates were altered. The details of certain missions remained classified. The silence that surrounded the Whirlwind's true operational history was not accidental. It was deliberate policy, maintained across decades by men who believed that admitting error was worse than perpetuating myth. The politicians and bureaucrats who had dismissed the aircraft in 1940 were long dead by the time the truth began to emerge. Their reputations could not be damaged. But the institutions they represented, the Air Ministry, the War Office, the structures of British military command, were invested in maintaining the narrative of their own infallibility. Rewriting the history of the Whirlwind would require admitting that the early dismissals were wrong. It would require crediting pilots whose names had been stripped from official histories. It would require acknowledging that an aircraft officially classified as a failure had actually been a success in a role that had never been publicly acknowledged. It was easier to let it fade. It was safer to let the men who flew it grow old and die without vindication. By the 1970s, the Whirlwind had become aviation folklore, a story told among elderly pilots in the bars of aviation clubs, a cautionary tale about the dangers of premature judgment, a ghost story of sorts. The aircraft itself existed only in photographs and technical drawings. No Whirlwind survives intact today. The last existing airframe was scrapped in 1956. The most complete surviving record of the Whirlwind's operational career exists in personal papers, the logbooks of dead pilots, the letters of engineers, the recorded interviews of men speaking in their final years. These fragments, pieced together by researchers willing to spend years tracking them down, tell a story that contradicts the official history in almost every particular. The Whirlwind was not a failure. It was a victim of timing and reputation. It was an aircraft that arrived too early in the war, was judged too hastily, and was eventually vindicated in a form that could not be publicly celebrated. By 1980, when the surviving pilots began to age into their 70s, a subtle shift occurred in the documentary record. Aviation historians, younger men and women, without personal investment in the pre-war reputation of the aircraft, began to publish research suggesting that the Whirlwind deserved reconsideration. Slowly and carefully, the true operational record began to emerge, but by then most of the pilots were too old, too tired, or too bound by military discipline to participate in their own vindication. The silence had calcified into habit. The secret had become too large to tell. In 2007, 62 years after the Whirlwind's operational retirement, the Ministry of Defense released a comprehensive dossier of wartime operations records pertaining to fighter aircraft deployed in intruder and night fighter roles. The release was mandated by Freedom of Information legislation. It was not offered willingly. Among the documents were operational summaries for RAF Squadrons 263 and 256. The records were sparse. Much had been destroyed or remained classified, but what survived was sufficient to alter the historical record definitively. The Whirlwind was credited with 57 confirmed kills and an additional 28 probable kills during the period from 1943 to 1945. These were not spectacular numbers compared to the great aces of the war, but they were substantial and significant. They placed the Whirlwind's operational record on par with aircraft that had been celebrated and remembered for decades. Moreover, the operational summary noted that the Whirlwind had maintained higher crew survival rates than comparable twin-engined fighters in similar roles. Its reputation as a widowmaker had been based on accidents in the training phase, not on operational failures. Once pilots learned to fly it correctly, the aircraft had proven reliable and survivable. The archival release sparked a minor scholarly attention. Aviation historians published papers. Museums reconsidered their exhibits. A handful of documentaries were produced for British television. The true story of the Whirlwind began, slowly, to replace the myth. But the men who had flown it were dying. By 2007, fewer than 50 surviving pilots remained. Most were in their mid-80s. James Harrow had been dead for 9 years. Flight Lieutenant David Carstairs, one of the pilots who had first understood the aircraft's true capabilities, had died in 2003. When researchers tried to conduct interviews with surviving pilots, they encountered a curious resistance. Some pilots refused to speak, citing the lifetime of secrecy as habit too deep to break. Others spoke reluctantly, as if revealing the truth was a betrayal of an oath they had taken 7 decades earlier. A few spoke openly, with evident relief that the story could finally be told. Wing Commander Herbert Melrose, the commanding officer who had revolutionized the Whirlwind's training protocol, was located in a care facility in Surrey in 2009. He was 93 years old and in declining health. A researcher was permitted a single interview session. When asked about the aircraft he had commanded, Melrose spoke with surprising clarity. "The Whirlwind taught me that history is written by people who make decisions, not by people who understand the facts. We knew what the aircraft could do. We proved it in the sky. But proving something and being believed are not the same thing. The Whirlwind was a weapon that had to be kept secret while it was effective, and then forgotten when it was no longer useful. That is the nature of warfare. That is the nature of reputation." He died 6 months later. His interview was archived and eventually made available online in 2015, long after his death. By 2015, the true history of the Whirlwind had been substantially recovered and documented. Aviation historians had assembled a comprehensive picture from declassified documents, private papers, and the final testimonies of surviving pilots. The aircraft that had been laughed at, dismissed, and forgotten had been resurrected in historical truth. Yet in the popular imagination, the Whirlwind remained obscure. It was not famous like the Spitfire. It did not appear in popular histories. It was mentioned only in specialized aviation texts and in academic papers that few people read. The vindication came too late for the pilots who had earned it. The recognition came in a form that could not undo the years of silence, the lost opportunities for celebration, the burden of carrying a secret that society had forbidden them to share. In the end, the Whirlwind's most profound legacy was not operational or technical. It was human. It was the story of men who performed extraordinary duties in obscurity, who flew difficult aircraft without recognition, who contributed to the war effort in a way that could not be publicly acknowledged until long after it mattered. The aircraft that had been built to change everything had indeed changed everything, but only in the secret spaces where such changes could occur. The laughter had been answered, but the answer had come in whispers, decades after the speakers were gone. The whirlwind remains today a symbol of something larger than itself. The cost of shame, the price of bureaucratic pride, and the peculiar tragedy of being vindicated long after vindication can matter. The aircraft changed everything, but no one was permitted to know it until everything had already changed beyond recognition. Subscribe to our channel to explore more cases and curiosities from World War II. Thank you for following the story. See you in the next video.